The verdict was announced in 2023. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, relatives of victims, law enforcement representatives, and the simply curious. Everyone was waiting to see what punishment would be handed down to a man who had terrorized an entire region for more than 10 years. The judge read the verdict for several hours. Every episode of criminal activity had to be announced, every charge qualified, every sentence justified. Finally, the numbers everyone had been waiting for were spoken aloud. Georgy Uglava, known by the nickname Takhi, was sentenced to 17 years and 6 months in a maximum security penal colony, along with a fine of 120,000 rubles. 17 and a half years. Uglava was 62 years old at the time of sentencing. The sentence was counted from February 1, 2015, the day of his arrest. This meant that he would not be released, if he was released at all, until 2032, at the age of 71. For a man of his age and lifestyle, this was effectively a life sentence, which meant only one thing. Before long, he would die. Prison wears the body down faster than life on the outside, and at his age, every year behind bars takes several years off your life. Takhi listened to the verdict without emotion. He had expected something like this, but had hoped for less. Those hopes were not realized. A few years later, rumors would circulate inside the prison system that Takhi had died, or, more precisely, that he had been killed, ordered by his own people. But is that really what happened? Let's start from the beginning. February 2015, an upscale apartment in central Moscow. 20 men are seated around a massive table, the cream of Russia's criminal world. Thieves-in-law from across the country had gathered for a meeting to divide spheres of influence and decide the fate of millions of rubles from the communal criminal fund. Among them is a stocky man with a piercing gaze, known to everyone as Takhi. Georgy Uglava, the overseer of the Trans-Baikal region, feels himself at the top of the world. Behind him lie 10 years of unchallenged power over an entire region, 70 million rubles in his pocket, and an army of associates ready to carry out any order. But he doesn't know that at this very moment, black FSB vehicles are pulling up to the building's entrance. In 5 minutes, the door will be smashed in, and the life he spent 3 decades building will collapse in an instant. But this story began much earlier, in a distant Georgian city, where a boy with burning eyes dreamed of becoming someone in a world governed by criminal codes, not laws. Kutaisi, 1961. A city that had already given the criminal world dozens of prominent names was about to produce one more future thief-in-law. On the 4th of May, Georgy Uglava was born into an ordinary Georgian family. Kutaisi in those years was something of a training ground for the criminal world. The unwritten codes were absorbed with mother's milk, and respect for thieves-in-law was woven into the local culture. The boy grew up in an atmosphere where the romance of crime intertwined with harsh reality. Neighborhood authority figures hushed adult conversations about someone who was doing time the right way, stories about justice by criminal code. All of this shaped the worldview of the future Takhi. From an early age, Georgy understood a simple truth. In his world, there were 2 paths: work for pennies or take what wasn't nailed down. He chose the second. Petty theft began in his teenage years. Nothing serious. Pockets of distracted passers-by, shop shelves, occasionally something more substantial. But each job honed his skills and built his reputation among his peers. The young man was bold, but not reckless. He knew how to calculate risk and always recognized when it was time to retreat. These qualities would later help him survive the harshest situations. In the early 1980s, Uglava made a decision that would change his fate. He moved to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. The northern capital beckoned with possibilities. There, if you weren't afraid to take risks, real money could be made. The 23-year-old from Kutaisi quickly integrated into the local criminal scene. The Georgian diaspora in Leningrad was strong, and his compatriots helped him find his footing. Uglava went back to what he did best: theft. But this time, the stakes were higher and the prizes bigger. On July 10, 1984, luck turned against the young thief. He was caught in the act of attempted theft. The trial was swift and harsh: 3.5 years in prison. For many, such a sentence would have been a tragedy, the end of a career. But for Georgy, it turned out to be the beginning of his real path. Prison in the criminal world is a university. It offers an education that no institution can provide. It teaches you to survive, tests you to your limits, and determines who you will become: a nobody or an authority. Behind bars, Uglava carried himself with dignity. He followed all the unwritten rules, did not break under pressure from prison administration, did not inform, did not stoop to dirty tricks. The thieves' code demanded an iron will and the ability to keep your word even when it cost you everything. The young inmate passed this test flawlessly. It was during those years that his fellow inmates gave him the nickname that would stick forever: Takhi. Why that particular name, history does not say, but it took hold and became his second name in criminal circles. 3.5 years flew by. Uglava served his full sentence, not losing a single day to early parole. This was a matter of principle. Serve it all the way through. Show that you aren't afraid of prison and that you live by the code. When he was released in the late 1980s, he was 25 years old, and he returned to his native Georgia a completely different man. If before prison he had been an ambitious young man with criminal inclinations, he was now a hardened criminal who had done time and knew the value of word and honor in that world. In Georgia, he was welcomed with respect. The local authorities could see that the young thief carried himself correctly, honored all the traditions, and didn't throw his weight around. He quickly integrated into the criminal hierarchy of Kutaisi, made useful connections, and demonstrated that he was prepared to live by the laws of the criminal world to the end. And then came the moment that would mark the pinnacle of his young career: his coronation as a thief in law. 1987. Georgy Uglava is only 25 years old when respected veterans of the criminal world decide that he is worthy of the title. The coronation as a thief in law is not just a ceremony. It is recognition that a person lives by the code, that he can be trusted with the communal fund, that he is prepared to answer for his words with his life. To receive such a status at 25 is a tremendous honor and a rarity. Thieves in law are usually older men, proven by years and by prison. But Takhi had shown that age is not the most important thing when you have backbone and the respect of your brotherhood. From that moment, he became part of the criminal elite, a man whose word meant more than any written contract. But fate had a surprise in store for Uglava, one that would go down in history as one of the most absurd legal anomalies of the post-Soviet era. After the collapse of the USSR in 1992, his old case was suddenly revisited. That very same theft from 1984, for which he had already served 3.5 years, unexpectedly resurfaced. In the chaos of the post-Soviet transition, when laws were changing, files were disappearing, and histories were being rewritten, someone's decision brought the case back to court, and the court issued a new sentence: 4 more years in prison for the very same crime. How could this even happen? Legal experts still debate it. Being punished twice for the same crime violates every principle of law. But in the 90s, things happened that made even this case seem unremarkable against the broader backdrop. Uglava took the situation philosophically. What will be, will be. He went back to prison, went through the full cycle again, served the sentence with full rigor. In total, For a single theft, he served 7.5 years across 3 separate stints. This had never happened to anyone else. By the mid-90s, when Uglava was released after his second stretch for the same theft, the country had changed beyond recognition. The Soviet Union had collapsed, new states had emerged from its ruins, and Russia had plunged into the chaos of criminal wars. Thieves-in-law, who during Soviet times had lived by strict rules and kept to the shadows, were now stepping into the spotlight. Organized crime groups were forming, territories were being divided, enormous money was in play. Moscow had become the center of this new criminal world, a magnet for everyone who wanted a piece of the pie. Takhi was drawn to the capital too. In 1992, he moved to Moscow, where dozens of criminal figures from across the former Soviet Union had already established themselves. The Georgian diaspora was strong, connections were in place, and it seems that here he could truly spread his wings. But reality turned out to be harsher. Moscow was overflowing with thieves-in-law and criminal bosses. Every street, every market, every business was already under someone's protection. Newcomers, even those bearing the title of thief-in-law, had to fight hard just for a place in the sun. Uglava quickly realized that the power he had dreamed of was not on offer in Moscow. Too many strong players, too many already divided spheres of influence. He could have joined someone else's crew, become one of many. But Takhi wanted more. He wanted to be first, to be an overseer, someone who made decisions and controlled territory. In the capital, that was impossible, and he began casting his eye toward the regions. For several months, he assessed his options, built contacts, and studied the situation in various cities. But fate had other plans. If you're interested in this story about the rise and fall of one of the most influential criminals of the post-Soviet world, subscribe to the channel and hit like. In the comments, write whether you already knew about Takhi and the AUE movement he created. It only gets better from here. Several months after moving to Moscow, Uglava was arrested again. His third conviction caught up with him almost as soon as he tried to establish himself in the capital. The details of this particular case were lost in the margins of history, but the fact remained. Fate, in the criminal world, rarely grants a long reprieve. The sentence was relatively short, but it showed Takhi one crucial thing. In Moscow, he would always be in someone's crosshairs, with competitors or cops around every corner. He had to find a different path. In the late 1990s, Uglava made a strategic decision that would define his fate for the next 20 years. He chose to leave Moscow for the regions, not just anywhere, but somewhere he could build a genuine vertical of power. His first stop was the Tver Oblast. He had connections there with a local criminal overseer known by the nickname Komunyai, a respected thief who controlled the criminal landscape of the region. Takhi joined his team, became his closest associate, and began learning how to manage not just a gang, but an entire system. Working with Komunyai gave Uglava invaluable experience. He learned how regional crime was structured, how to build relationships with local authorities and businesses, how to collect tribute and distribute money through the criminal fund. But most importantly, he realized that in the regions, a man could become a true lord of his domain if he organized things correctly. In Moscow, you were one of 100. Out here, you could be the only one. This thought gave him no peace, and Takhi began planning his next move. In 2000, however, prison once again cut his plans short. His fourth conviction was the most serious to date. The court sentenced him to 10 years in prison. The charges were heavy, and the sentence matched. On April 4th, the verdict was handed down, and Uglava was sent to a penal colony. But even there, he didn't waste time. In prison, a thief-in-law holds a special status. He is respected, his words are heeded, people help him. Takhi used those years to strengthen ties with other criminal authorities across the country, build contacts nationwide, and think through his strategy for when he got out. The case was reviewed, and the sentence was reduced to 7 years. This was a stroke of luck. 3 fewer years meant getting out earlier without losing all the connections he had built. Time moves differently in prison, but for a man with plans, every year counts. Uglava held himself well, continued living by the code, helped young inmates navigate the criminal laws of prison, and reinforced his authority. By the time he was released in 2007, he already had a clear plan, where to go and what to do. On June 10, 2007, Georgy Uglava walked free. He was 46 years old, with 4 convictions behind him and the title of thief-in-law, a title that, in the criminal world, means more than any achievement the legal world can offer. He did not return to Moscow or to Tver. His choice fell on the Trans-Baikal region, a remote territory on the borders of Mongolia and China, where the criminal climate was relatively calm and, most importantly, where there was no powerful thief-in-law already controlling the entire territory. It was the ideal place to build an empire. Trans-Baikal in the late 2000s was a land of opportunity. The region was rich in natural resources. Major freight routes passed through it. There was real business and real money. But the criminal structure was fragmented. Small gangs divided up districts. There was no single center of power. Uglava saw his chance. He began by making contact with local criminal figures, not through conflict, but through negotiation. A thief-in-law, with his experience and connections across the country, was a figure people wanted to deal with. The first months were spent mapping the balance of power. Who did what? Who stood behind whom? Where pressure could be applied, and where it was better to negotiate. Takhi acted carefully, but with purpose. He didn't rush to seize everything at once. He built the system gradually. First, he reached agreements with several influential figures on the division of spheres of influence. Each received his own territory, his own piece of the pie, but all acknowledged that Uglava was the chief, the overseer of all Trans-Baikal. This was power not through force, but through authority and recognition. By the early 2000s, the structure had fully taken shape. Takhi had a team of district-level overseers. Each controlled his own territory, collected tribute, resolved conflicts, and sent money to the communal fund. The treasurer was Fyodor Titov, known as Tit, a man Uglava trusted with money, which, in the criminal world, is the highest form of trust. His closest associate and right-hand man was Gogita Gavishiani, known as Jonik, another Georgian, loyal to Takhi to the end. Together, they built a system that would run like clockwork for more than 10 years. The group's activities were wide-ranging. The main income came from extorting local business people. The scheme was refined to the smallest detail. Representatives would approach an entrepreneur and explain that he was now under protection, which meant he had to pay regular tribute. Refusing was not an option. The consequences could be severe. The amounts depended on the size of the business, but everyone paid, from the owners of kiosks to large companies. The money flowed into the communal fund. A portion stayed with Takhi. The rest was distributed among the district overseers. Another profitable operation was car theft, but this was not simple car theft for resale. The scheme was more cynical and more lucrative. A car would be stolen from its owner, and a few days later, someone would contact the owner and offer to sell it back. The buyback price was lower than the vehicle's market value, but higher than what an insurance payout would cover. People agreed. Nobody wanted to lose their car. Over 10 years, hundreds of vehicles were stolen and sold back to their owners this way. Robberies and armed attacks were also part of the group's arsenal. Targets were chosen carefully. People known to carry cash, jewelry stores, small businesses that kept money on the premises. They moved fast and hard, leaving no witnesses and no trace. Fraud was another revenue stream. Real estate scams, fake transactions, swindling trusting citizens. All of this operated like a conveyor belt, generating steady income. But the most cynical episode of all was the extortion of money from military personnel. Takhi's associates reached even into Military Unit 54,160, located in the settlement of Gorny. This was a classified unit serving Russia's strategic nuclear forces. Contractors and junior officers earned relatively good salaries by regional standards, and the criminal gang decided to put them on a tribute schedule. The scheme was simple. Local crime figures would approach the servicemen and explain that they were now obligated to contribute a portion of their wages to the communal fund. Those who refused received threats or physical violence. This unit would later become known across the country for a tragic reason. In October 2019, Private Ramil Shamsutdinov would go on a shooting rampage there, killing 8 fellow soldiers. The investigation would establish that one of the contributing factors was pressure and extortion by criminal figures linked to Takhi's group. Military wages were flowing into the criminal fund, and those who tried to resist faced brutal consequences. This episode would reveal just how deeply the criminal structure had penetrated every layer of life in the region. Over 10 years of active operation, Uglava's group committed at least 164 documented crimes. These were only the ones the investigation managed to prove. The real number may be several times higher. 170 people were officially recognized as victims. Each of them lost money, property, and, in some cases, their health and peace of mind. The scale of the criminal activity was so enormous that the investigation took nearly 5 years, and the indictment grew to 11,000 pages. But perhaps most staggering was the amount of money that passed through Takhi's hands. According to investigators, Uglava received approximately 70 million rubles from the black criminal fund of Trans-Baikal, his personal cut, the portion he took as overseer. Another roughly equal amount went into the white communal fund, the all-Russian criminal treasury distributed among all thieves-in-law. In total, at least 140 million rubles passed through Takhi's system, and that is a conservative estimate. On these funds, Uglava lived lavishly. He did not remain confined to Chita, but moved between Moscow and Kyiv, rented upscale apartments, and denied himself nothing. At the same time, he was clever enough not to flaunt expensive cars or real estate registered in his own name. All transactions were conducted in cash. This was a point of principle. No bank transfers, no electronic trails. Money was passed hand to hand, stored in trusted locations, and spent with caution. This precaution allowed him to stay below the radar of law enforcement for many years. But money wasn't everything. For the system to run smoothly, he needed cover inside law enforcement. And Takhi had that cover. During the investigation, the names of 2 officers from the regional organized crime unit surfaced, Ligdanov and Smolin. The irony was bitter. The very men whose professional duty was to fight organized crime were working for one of the region's largest criminal groups. They shielded Takhi's associates who were involved in drug trafficking, covered for the right people, and leaked information about upcoming operations. Over 5 years, these 2 officers received nearly 5 million rubles from Takhi's group. The money was handed over in cash, meetings took place in secure locations, everything was organized so as to leave no trace. Ligdanov and Smolin provided what the criminal world calls a roof, protection from sudden raids, advance warnings about inspections, and sometimes direct patronage of specific operations. With them in his pocket, Uglava's group felt practically invulnerable. When you have officers from the organized crime unit on your payroll, you can sleep soundly at night. These corrupt officers worked especially closely with the Romani drug dealers who were part of Takhi's network. Drug trafficking has always been among the most profitable branches of criminal enterprise, and Trans-Baikal's proximity to the Chinese border provided excellent opportunities. The Romani groups handled distribution, while the officers provided security. This scheme ran for years, funneling millions into the communal fund and into the pockets of everyone in the chain. But, as the saying goes, nothing lasts forever under the sun, and sooner or later, every system breaks down. While Takhi was building his criminal empire in Trans-Baikal, a phenomenon was gaining strength in the region that would later make headlines across the entire country: the AUE movement. The acronym stood for Arestovskoye Orkaganskoye Jedinstvo, the Convict Brotherhood, or the Prison Code is One, and behind those words lay an entire ideology. The essence was simple: the romanticization of prison life, criminal codes, and underworld culture among young people. Teenagers banded together in groups, called themselves real convicts, lived by the code, and collected money for the communal fund. And this is where the most scandalous chapter of Georgy Uglava's story begins. In 2011, at a session of Russia's Human Rights Council, a loud claim was made. The AUE movement in Trans-Baikal had been created and was being directed by the thief-in-law known as Takhi. This was not an unfounded accusation. Experts studying the AUE phenomenon pointed to a direct connection between the spread of this ideology in the region and the activities of Uglava's group. Moreover, in a number of academic papers and criminology dissertations, Takhi was directly named as the founder of the AUE system in the form in which it spread across Russia. How did it work? Uglava's associates were instructed to propagate the criminal ideology among young people. In schools, vocational colleges, and on the streets, recruiters began appearing who would tell teenagers about the romance of criminal life, about how cool it was to live by the code, and how a thief-in-law was an authority figure and a role model. Children were shown gangster films, given prison literature to read, and taught criminal slang. Many teenagers, especially those from troubled homes, took the bait. It seemed to them like a path to respect and strength. But the real point was not ideology. It was money. As soon as a teenager fell under the influence of AUE, they would start being pressured to contribute to the communal fund. The amounts were small, whatever pocket money they had, but when you multiply small amounts across hundreds and thousands of teenagers, the sum becomes considerable. Children were handing over money their parents had given them for lunch or entertainment, paying into the criminal fund, and believing it was the right and honorable thing to do. They didn't understand that they were being used, that behind the fine words about brotherhood and the code lay simple extortion. The AUE system spread through Trans-Baikal like wildfire. From a regional problem, it became a national one. Teenagers in other regions began imitating the youths of Trans-Baikal, forming their own groups, collecting their own funds. Online communities appeared where young people exchanged criminal codes, posted photos with criminal symbols, and discussed the affairs of criminal bosses. It was a genuine subculture, and its roots led back to Trans-Baikal, to Georgy Uglava, known as Takhi. Vladimir Kantemir, editor-in-chief of the Trans-Baikal newspaper Vetrayal, later confirmed this account. According to him, Trans-Baikal was one of the first regions where AUE, specifically as a system of levying tribute on young people, gained real momentum. And behind it stood a specific individual, a thief-in-law with enormous authority and connections across the country. Takhi had not simply created a criminal group. He had created an ideological machine that worked for him and continued to work even after he was placed in pretrial detention. Consider the scale. Thousands of teenagers across Russia were handing over their pocket money to criminal funds, not even realizing that they were feeding a criminal system. Parents didn't know where the money was going. Teachers were alarmed but powerless. The children genuinely believed they were living the right way, the proper way. And at the top of this pyramid sat thieves-in-law, collecting millions from this youth tribute. It is hard to imagine anything more cynical. The AUE movement grew so large that it attracted attention at the federal level. Media coverage emerged of school children beating classmates who refused to contribute to the criminal fund, of teenagers committing crimes to prove their worth to the criminal world, of children from stable families falling under the influence of this ideology. In 2020, Russia's Supreme Court would classify AUE as an extremist movement and ban it across the country. But by then, the system would already be entrenched in the minds of thousands of young people. Meanwhile, Takhi continued to live large and to tighten his grip on Trans-Baikal. By the mid-2000s, he was at the height of his power. The group was running like clockwork, money was flowing freely, the police cover was holding firm, and AUE was steadily replenishing the ranks of his associates and the communal fund. It seemed as if the system was unbreakable, as if Uglava would rule the criminal world of the region for years to come. But in February 2015, everything changed in an instant. FSB and Interior Ministry operatives spent a long time preparing for the operation to arrest Takhi and his network. They watched, gathered evidence, recruited informants, and monitored phones. Uglava was cautious, but after so many years, it was impossible not to leave traces. Someone in his inner circle had begun cooperating with law enforcement. Someone had spoken carelessly in the wrong place, or someone had simply been caught on a minor matter that unraveled the whole chain. By spring 2015, the security forces had enough material to move. The plan was clever: take everyone simultaneously so that no one could warn the others. Intelligence about an upcoming criminal gathering in Moscow provided the perfect opportunity. Takhi had traveled to the capital to meet with other bosses, among them Kaka Podpalya, known as Kaka Galsky, one of the most influential thieves-in-law, who would later be called the king of Russian organized crime. The meeting was taking place in an upscale apartment in central Moscow. Participants were discussing serious matters: distribution of the communal fund, resolution of disputes between groups, appointment of overseers in the regions. And then, in the middle of the meeting, there was a knock at the door. A second later, the door was smashed in by Special Forces officers. Operatives flooded into the apartment, ordered everyone to the floor, and slapped on handcuffs. Video of the arrest would later appear in the media. The footage showed men in camouflage pinning well-dressed men in expensive suits to the floor, someone attempting to make a phone call and being immediately restrained. Takhi did not resist. He understood the game was over. Along with him, Kaka Galsky and several other attendees were taken into custody. But this was only the beginning. Simultaneously with the Moscow operation, searches and arrests were being carried out in Chita. Officers from the Inter-District Organized Crime Unit of the Regional Criminal Investigation Department detained 10 members of Takhi's criminal network. Among them were district-level overseers from across the Trans-Baikal region: Treasurer Fyodor Titov, Tit, closest associate Gogita Gvishiani, Jonik, and other key figures. Within a matter of hours, the entire structure that Uglava had spent more than 10 years building was decapitated. The operation went off simultaneously and with precision. This spoke to months, if not years, of preparation. Every arrest had been planned down to the smallest detail. Every operative knew their role. Law enforcement understood they were dealing with dangerous individuals who had money, connections, and the capacity to disappear or organize resistance. So they acted fast and hard, giving no time to react. By evening of that day, all the key figures of Takhi's group were sitting in detention facilities, some in Moscow, some in Chita. For Uglava, this was a shock. He was accustomed to being in control, always one step ahead, with informants inside the police. But this time, the system had failed. Someone had betrayed him. Someone had talked. Or perhaps his luck had simply run out. Now, he sat in a Moscow pre-trial detention center, knowing that a long investigation and an inevitable trial lay ahead. At his age, he was 54, A new sentence could be his last. But Takhi would not have been a thief-in-law if he had surrendered without a fight. The first months of the investigation were the hardest. Investigators applied pressure, tried to break him down, offered cooperation in exchange for a lighter sentence. But Uglava held firm. He knew that a confession was the end, that any cooperation with investigators would destroy his standing in the criminal world. A thief-in-law does not inform, does not sell out his brothers, does not cut deals with the police. This is law. To violate it means death or disgrace, and for a thief, the two are often the same. Takhi stayed silent during interrogations, refused to give testimony, and invoked his right under Article 51 of the Russian Constitution, the right not to incriminate oneself. But not all of his associates were so steadfast. And here begins the most painful chapter of Uglava's story, the betrayal of his own team. The first to break was Fyodor Titov, Tit, the group's treasurer. The man Takhi had trusted with money, who knew all the financial flows, all the schemes, all the details of their operations. He cut a deal with the investigators, agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence and possible freedom. And he began to talk. Tit told investigators everything: how the tribute collection system worked, who paid how much, where the money went. About the car theft scheme, which vehicles were stolen, to whom they were returned, how much was charged for the return. About the robberies and armed attacks, who was targeted, how the spoils were divided, where stolen goods were hidden. About the fraud, what scams were run, who was deceived, how much was made. About extorting money from military personnel, how they made contact with servicemen, who specifically collected the money, how many soldiers paid tribute. Tit's testimony became the foundation of the prosecution's case. Investigators obtained a detailed picture of the group's criminal activities, the names of all participants, specific criminal episodes with dates, amounts, and detailed circumstances. On the basis of these statements, they began unraveling the entire case, interviewing victims, finding documentary corroboration, gathering additional evidence. Day by day, the case against Takhi and his people became more devastating. The treasurer's betrayal was the first serious crack in what had once been a monolithic structure. But it was not the only betrayal. The second person to give Takhi up was Andrei Kolichev, a member of the criminal circle. He had his own grievance against the boss. The matter involved a dispute over the division of money from the sale of a crane. Kolichev believed he was owed a specific amount, but Uglava and Jonik had, by his account, taken 400,000 rubles that were rightfully his. The conflict had been brewing, but Kolichev could not openly move against a thief-in-law. That would have been signing his own death warrant. But when he was arrested on a separate matter, he saw his chance for revenge. Kolichev also cut a pre-trial deal. He agreed to testify against Takhi, Jonik, and other members of the group. He described extortions he had personally participated in, other crimes he had witnessed, and the structure of the organization and the role of each member. His testimony added new dimensions to the prosecution's case. Then, Kolichev started to waver. He changed his testimony several times, tried to withdraw from the pre-trial agreement, apparently realizing that he had become an informant and traitor in the eyes of the criminal world. But it was too late. His testimony was on record and had entered the case file. The investigation worked without pause. It stretched for nearly 5 years, from February 2015 to early 2020. During that time, investigators conducted hundreds of investigative actions, interrogations, searches, confrontations between suspects, forensic examinations. They interviewed 170 victims, each of whom recounted their personal story of how Takhi's group had taken their money, property, or health. Many were afraid to testify, fearing retaliation, but the investigation guaranteed protection, and people began to speak. Documentary evidence was gathered: hospital records of beatings, surveillance camera footage, phone records, financial documents. Each crime had to be proven, each episode confirmed with hard facts. It was a titanic undertaking. By the end of the investigation, the case materials filled more than 260 volumes. The indictment alone ran to 11,000 pages, roughly the equivalent of 20 thick books. Trans-Baikal had never seen an organized crime case of such scale. The story of Takhi is approaching its conclusion, and what comes next is the most gripping part: the trial, the verdict, and the life of a thief-in-law behind bars. If you've been following the story, hit like and write in the comments what sentence you think Takhi ultimately received. Subscribe so you don't miss the finale. In January 2020, the investigation concluded. The criminal case, with its indictment, was forwarded to the prosecutor's office for approval. Prosecutors reviewed the materials, confirmed that all evidence had been gathered properly, and sent the case to court. Takhi and 10 of his associates were charged under several articles of Russia's criminal code. The primary charge was Article 210, organizing and leading a criminal organization, one of the most serious charges in Russian law, carrying the harshest prison terms. In addition to this, specific criminal episodes were charged: extortion, theft, robbery, armed robbery, and fraud. In total, 164 crimes were tallied. Each was described in the indictment with its date, location, circumstances, amount of damage, and the role of each participant. 170 people were recognized as victims, each with the right to claim compensation and participate in the proceedings. The scope of the charges was immense, and everyone understood that Uglava was facing a very serious sentence. The only question was, how serious? The trial began in March 2020 at the Trans-Baikal Regional Court in Chita. Takhi and his associates were to be tried in the territory where they had committed their crimes. The case was so high profile that it generated enormous interest across the region. Media followed every hearing, published reports, and sought expert commentary. For many residents of Trans-Baikal, this was a moment of reckoning. The man who had kept the region in fear for so many years was finally sitting in the dock. The trial dragged on for 3 years. 260 volumes of materials had to be studied, every victim heard, every piece of evidence examined. The defense tried to challenge the charges, find procedural violations, discredit witnesses. Takhi's lawyers knew their craft and used every available means to delay the proceedings and push for a lighter sentence. But the facts were too clear, the evidence too compelling, and the testimony of the traitors from within his own organization too detailed. During the trial, several notable episodes took place that showed that even behind bars, Takhi remained himself. In 2016, while being held in pre-trial detention, he threatened to kill the investigator handling his case. It was an open demonstration that the thief-in-law had not been broken, that he still considered himself in command. The threats were documented, and in June of that year, Uglava was additionally fined 120,000 rubles for threatening a public official with murder. A modest punishment, but it showed that even in detention, he had not calmed down. In early 2017, a darkly comic episode occurred that amused many observers. The local newspaper, Vetrayal, had been running a reader contest, with the prize being a book called Mirror, written behind bars by Dmitry Vedenikov, known as Vedera, the leader of the rival criminal gang Metsinatovsky. And who do you think won the contest? Georgy Uglava himself, the thief-in-law Takhi, sitting in a detention center, who had apparently decided to enter the giveaway out of boredom. He won a book written by his criminal adversary, who was himself serving 22 years in a strict regime colony for murder and robbery. This moment showed that even in the most difficult situation, Takhi had not lost his sense of humor or his interest in life. Many saw it as a provocation, a thief-in-law enjoying himself entering contests while his victims suffered. But for Uglava himself, it was a way of showing that he was unbroken, that his spirit was still strong. In prison culture, such things matter. If you show weakness, you lose standing. and Takhi had no intention of losing his standing. Dmitry Vidernikov also played a role in Takhi's case. He was specifically transferred from Krasnoyarsk, where he was serving his sentence, to Chita to give testimony as a witness. Videra had been a criminal opponent of Uglava. Their groups had competed for influence in the region and had clashed on multiple occasions. Now, one sat in the dock while the other gave evidence against him. For Takhi, it was humiliating to listen to his enemy describe his activities before judges and prosecutors. But he had no choice. In January 2021, another episode revealed a human side of Georgy Uglava. At one of the court hearings, he addressed the presiding judge with an unusual request. Takhi asked that the length of telephone calls to his family be increased from 3 to 5 minutes. And he explained his request in simple and unexpectedly moving words. At present, the duration is 3 minutes. When I call my children, they spend those 3 minutes just remembering who I am. Those words landed like a revelation. Behind the mask of the hardened thief-in-law, behind the reputation of a brutal criminal boss, was a father who missed his children. A man who for years had kept an entire region in fear was now asking for 2 extra minutes to speak with his son or daughter. For many, it came as a surprise. Takhi had a family. He had people close to him. He had human feelings. The court secretary promised that the request would be honored the same day. Such a small thing, to give a man 2 extra minutes to talk with his children. This moment says a great deal about the price paid not only by criminals, but by their families. Takhi's children had grown up without a father. For most of their lives, he had been either in prison, on the run, or occupied with criminal business. To them, he was practically a stranger, a voice on the phone every few days. Now, when calls came in from the detention center, they genuinely needed a few moments to remember who was calling. And then they tried to fit everything they wanted to say into 3 minutes. And Takhi understood that he had missed the most important thing in life, the chance to be there for his children. But sentimental moments did not change the substance of the case. The court continued its work, and with each hearing, it became clearer that the verdict would be severe. The prosecution had presented so much evidence that the defense had nothing to counter it. The testimonies of the traitors were corroborated by documents, the documents by victim statements, and those in turn by expert analysis and recordings. It was a hermetically sealed system of proof, impossible to break through. Takhi and his lawyers understood this, but they fought to the end. Nikolai Buglak, Alexander Tsipilov, Vladimir Trudolyubov, Gogita Gvishiani, Jonik, and other associates sat alongside Takhi on the defendant's bench. Each of them knew a long sentence awaited. Some tried to shift blame onto others. Some stayed silent. Some gave confused testimony. But all understood that the group had been broken, the system destroyed, and the era of Takhi's rule in Trans-Baikal was over. Now, there was only the wait for the verdict, to find out how many years each of them would spend in a penal colony. His associates received serious sentences of their own. Nikolai Buglak, one of Takhi's closest partners, received 16 years in a strict regime colony. Alexander Tsipilov received 15 years and 11 months. Vladimir Trudolyubov received the longest sentence among the associates, 19 years and 6 months. He was deemed the most dangerous member of the group, responsible for the most serious crimes. Gogita Gvishiani, Jonik, Takhi's right hand, also received a lengthy sentence, though the precise figure was not made public. The entire leadership of the group was locked away for many years. The remaining members received shorter sentences, still measured in years. It might have seemed as if the story was over. The criminals were punished, justice had prevailed, and the region could breathe easy. But Takhi would not have been a thief-in-law if he had simply accepted the verdict. The defense filed an appeal. The lawyers tried to identify procedural violations, challenge the evidence, and secure either a retrial or at least a reduced sentence. They argued that some testimony came from individuals who had cut deals with prosecutors, that certain evidence was questionable, and that the sentence was disproportionate. But the appeals court upheld the verdict in full. The defense then went further, to Russia's Supreme Court. This was the last resort, the final chance. Lawyers prepared a cassation appeal, gathered new arguments, searched for any opening. The case was examined in the Supreme Court. All materials were reviewed, and the legality of the process verified. In the end, the Supreme Court confirmed the legality of the Trans-Baikal Regional Court's verdict. The appeal was rejected in its entirety. No reductions, no retrials. 17 years and 6 months stood firm. This was officially confirmed by the regional prosecutor's press office. For Takhi, this was the final blow. The hope that the highest judicial authority would find grounds for review had not materialized. There was nothing left but to serve the sentence. 17.5 years in a strict regime penal colony is no joke. It is a regime where your every minute is controlled, where any violation is punished with solitary confinement, where living conditions are far from comfortable. For a man accustomed to power and luxury, this would be a particularly punishing ordeal. But he had no choice. Uglava was sent to serve his sentence. He was transferred to one of the strict regime colonies, where he would spend the remainder of his years. In prison, a thief-in-law holds a special status. He is respected by fellow inmates. People turn to him for counsel. He remains an authority even behind bars. But that respect does not make the sentence shorter or the conditions softer. Takhi would wake at the sound of a bell, work on the prison production line, eat prison food, sleep on a bunk, and count the days until a release that would come, if it came at all, only many years away. But the story of Takhi did not end there. In 2019, while already being held in pretrial detention awaiting sentencing, he and his associate Jonique received yet another criminal case. Investigators charged them with additional crimes, extortions, thefts, and frauds that had not been included in the first case. This was a continuation of the unraveling of the group's criminal web. The more investigators dug, the more episodes they found. The new case included the same Article 210, organizing a criminal organization, but now with entirely new criminal episodes. According to the newspaper Vecherka, the new case involved several dozen episodes of extortion, fraud, and theft committed by Takhi and Jonique as part of their criminal organization. The investigation continued. Victims gave testimony. New evidence was gathered. For Uglava, this meant that years could be added to his 17.5. Fate was not sparing him. Every time it seemed the case was closed, new charges surfaced. This was the price for years of operating without consequence, for hundreds of crimes committed, for a life outside the law. One of the episodes in the new case was the story involving Andrei Kolichev and the 400,000 rubles from the crane sale. Takhi and Jonique were charged with having extracted that money from Kolichev when dividing the proceeds from the deal. This story had come up before, but now it was formalized as a separate charge. Kolichev gave testimony, then changed it, tried to withdraw from the pre-trial agreement, but was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in a penal colony. He paid for his own criminal activity, but in doing so, his testimony helped put his former associates away for even longer. Together with Takhi and Jonique in that 2017 case, Yevgeny Goncharov and Anver Shanidze also sat in the dock. The latter, however, did not survive to hear the verdict. He died of health complications. Prison and age had done their work. Goncharov received his sentence and was sent to serve it. All of them were part of the system Uglava had built, and now All of them were paying for it. The criminal organization had been completely dismantled. Every key participant was in prison. Assets had been confiscated, connections severed. What had been built over more than 10 years had collapsed within a matter of months. And what became of the AUE movement that Takhi had created? It did not disappear with his arrest. On the contrary, in the initial period after Uglava's detention, the movement actually intensified. Young people saw the arrest of their idol as an injustice, a persecution of the criminal world. Supportive posts appeared on social media. Teenagers raised money to send to the communal fund, and they held their own version of protest actions. AUE continued to spread across regions, capturing new territories and new minds. The ideology that Uglava had laid down was living a life of its own. But the state finally began to take the problem seriously. Media outlets started publishing stories about how school children were beating classmates for refusing to contribute to the criminal fund, how teenagers were committing crimes to gain status in criminal circles, how children from stable homes were falling under the influence of criminal ideology. Parents were sounding alarms. Teachers didn't know what to do. The police began conducting preventive conversations, but this achieved little. The authority of the thief-in-law in the eyes of these children was higher than the authority of parents or teachers. In 2020, a landmark event occurred. Russia's Supreme Court classified AUE as an extremist movement and banned it across the country. This meant that promoting AUE, wearing its symbols, or calling on others to follow the criminal code could now result in real prison time. Arrests of movement activists began, online communities were blocked, and schools were raided. Gradually, the movement began to fade, retreating underground. But the roots it had put down over years of existence have never been fully eradicated. Many experts consider AUE to have been one of the most cynical projects of the modern criminal world, using children to collect money, manipulating their minds, making them believe in the romance of prison life. This crossed a line even by the standards of the old-school criminal world. Traditional thieves-in-law of the Soviet era never stooped to such methods. They lived by a code that explicitly forbade drawing children into crime. But Takhi was a representative of a new generation for whom money had displaced principles. The story of Georgy Uglava is the story of the rise and fall of a man who wanted to be king of the criminal world. He was born into an ordinary family in Kutaisi, started with petty theft, passed through multiple prison terms, earned the title of thief-in-law, and built a criminal empire in a remote corner of Russia. At the peak of his power, he controlled an entire region, had police officers in his pocket, collected millions of rubles, and lived without limits. His power seemed unshakable. But sooner or later, every criminal empire falls. Someone betrays, someone makes a mistake, or someone simply gets caught in the machinery of a law enforcement system that never stands still. In Takhi's case, everything converged at once. Betrayal by his closest associates, thorough investigative work, and evidence accumulated over years. The system he believed to be rock solid developed a crack, and that crack became an avalanche. February 2015 divided his life into before and after. Before, power, money, influence. After, detention, trial, verdict. 17 years and 6 months in a strict regime colony is effectively the end of his life as a free man. Even if he walks out in 2032, he will be 71 years old. That is not an age for crime, for power, for building new schemes. That is an age when you think about how to live out your remaining days quietly. Whether he will even reach that age is an open question. Prison is cruel to the elderly. Illness is not treated as well as it is on the outside. Conditions are harsh. Many do not survive long sentences. And the children he called from detention, begging for 2 extra minutes, they will grow up without a father, bearing a mark. the children of a thief-in-law. For some, this will be a source of pride. For others, a source of shame. But the fact remains, their father chose the criminal path and paid for it with his freedom and with any chance of being beside his family. This, too, is part of the price criminals pay. It is not only they themselves who suffer, it is those closest to them. The Trans-Baikal region became calmer after the arrest of Takhi and the dismantling of his group. The constant extortions disappeared, cars stopped going missing, business people could breathe again. But to say that crime vanished entirely would be untrue. The space that opened up quickly began to fill with new players. Such is the nature of the criminal world. A power vacuum does not stay empty for long. But the level of violence and lawlessness that characterized Takhi's era did not return. The next generations of criminal figures operated more cautiously, understanding that the state was no longer willing to look the other way when it came to organized crime. The corrupt officers Ligdinov and Smolin also faced justice. They were convicted of bribery and abuse of power. The 5 million rubles they had taken from Takhi's group brought them no happiness. They lost their jobs, their reputations, and their freedom. This became a lesson for other law enforcement officers. Getting involved with organized crime is dangerous. Sooner or later, it will surface. Of course, corruption in the police didn't disappear entirely, but specifically in Trans-Baikal, after this high-profile case, it became considerably harder to find officers willing to provide cover for criminal gangs. Fyodor Titov, the treasurer who turned state's evidence, received his deal with the investigators. His sentence was significantly shorter than those of the other group members. He may even have been released early or received a suspended sentence. But in the criminal world, he is now nothing. Informant, rat, traitor, these labels will follow him to the end of his life. No self-respecting criminal will ever shake his hand, sit at the same table with him, or trust him with anything of consequence. He preserved his freedom, but lost his honor. And in the criminal world, that is worse than death. Andrei Kolichev is serving his 7-year sentence. He too is an informant, a traitor, but his fate is a little more complex. He attempted to withdraw from his pre-trial agreement, changed his testimony, apparently realizing the full horror of his position. But it was too late. The testimony was already on the record and the case had gone to court. Now he sits knowing that he helped put Takhi away while having landed a considerable sentence himself. Whether he will come out alive is an open question. Informants are treated a particular way in prison, and even the presence of a thief-in-law in another cell does not guarantee safety for a traitor. Gogita Gvishiani, Jonik, stayed true to Takhi to the end. He did not betray, did not cut deals, held himself with dignity throughout the trial. For this, he earned respect in the criminal world, but paid with a long sentence. He and Takhi continued to communicate in detention, discussing affairs and remembering old times. In 2019, when they were handed a new set of charges, they reviewed the case materials together and prepared for the new trial together. Jonik remained the right hand, even behind bars. The AUE movement, banned in 2020, left a deep mark on Russian society. Thousands of teenagers passed through its ideology. Many had already committed crimes under its influence, some had received convictions, and some lives had been ruined. Parents still recall with horror the time when their children would come home and talk about criminal codes, about how they had to contribute to the communal fund, about how being a thief was something to aspire to. Psychologists worked with these children, trying to pull them out of the romance of crime and back to a normal life. Many experts agree that AUE was made possible by several converging factors. First, economic crisis and poverty in the regions. Teenagers from troubled homes were looking for identity, for a way to earn respect, and the criminal subculture gave them that. Second, the romanticization of organized crime in popular culture. Films, TV series, and songs about gangsters created the image of the thief as a hero, powerful and just. Third, a failure of preventive work. Schools and police alike ignored for a long time what was happening to young people. Takhi was extremely skilled at exploiting all of these factors. He didn't simply create a criminal organization. He created an ideology that worked for him and continued to work even after his arrest. It was brilliant and cynical in equal measure. Recruiting children through the romanticization of criminal life, extracting money from them under the guise of contributions to the communal fund, raising a new generation of criminals who would replenish the ranks of his organization. It was all carefully thought through and ran like clockwork. By the time the state woke up and began combating AUE, the movement had already spread across the entire country. Today, in 2025, Georgy Uglava, Takhi, is held in a strict regime penal colony somewhere in Russia. He is 64 years old. 7 more years remain before his possible release. He wakes to a bell, goes to work in the prison workshop, eats institutional food, sleeps on a bunk. In the evenings, he perhaps thinks back to the old days, when he stood at the top of the criminal world, when he controlled an entire region, when he lived in luxury and denied himself nothing. Now that life seems like a dream. The reality is gray prison walls, bars on the windows, and years still ahead. Sometimes his children call. 5 minutes of conversation, which he managed to obtain at that court hearing. In those 5 minutes, he has to find out how they are doing, what is new, and tell them that everything is fine. Weakness is not an option. Complaints are not an option. A thief-in-law must carry himself with dignity, even in the harshest conditions. But after the call ends and the silence sets in, thoughts come about how life has passed, how the choice was made long ago, and how the bills must now be settled. The story of Georgy Uglava is a classic example of the fate of a thief-in-law of the Soviet and post-Soviet school. He was coronated at 25, attained the highest status in the criminal world, and built his empire. But in the end, it all came down to prison. That is how the lives of most thieves-in-law end, either a bullet or a bunk. The romance of the criminal world exists only in the movies and in songs. The reality is far harsher. Constant risk, betrayal by friends, pursuit by the police, and in the end, either death or long years behind bars. Takhi lived a vivid life. He saw rises and falls, controlled millions, held power over thousands. But at what cost? For most of his life, he was in prison. His first sentence in the 80s, the second and third in the 90s, the fourth in the 2000s, and now a fifth, which will most likely be his last. If you add up all his sentences, out of 64 years of life, he spent perhaps 25 to 30 years as a free man. The rest was the penal colony. Was it worth it? For him, perhaps yes. The criminal world has its own system of values. To be a thief-in-law is to have prestige, respect, and power. It is what people are willing to sacrifice their freedom and their lives for. Takhi got everything he wanted: status, money, influence. Yes, in the end, it was all taken away. But there were years when he stood at the summit. And those years, perhaps, outweigh all the deprivations that followed, in his own mind. This is the psychology of the criminal authority. Better to live one day as a lion than a lifetime as a sheep. But for society, his story is a lesson in where the romanticization of crime leads. A lesson in what happens when the activities of organized criminal groups are ignored. A lesson in how ordinary people suffer at the hands of figures like him. 170 victims in the Takhi case are 170 damaged lives. Some lost money, some lost a car, some lost their business, some their health. The servicemen taxed into tribute lived in constant fear. Business owners could not work in peace, knowing that at any moment someone could come demanding payment. And the children drawn into AUE? How many teenagers went down the criminal path, having believed in the romance of criminal life? How many of them received convictions, had their lives broken, ended up in prison? These numbers don't appear in the official statistics on the Takhi case, but they exist. Somewhere in juvenile detention facilities sit young people who, at 14 or 15 years old, went out to rob or beat people because someone told them it was right, that it was how real men lived. And behind all of it stood Georgy Uglava. Was the sentence fair? 17.5 years. Is that much or little for 164 crimes, for founding a criminal organization, for years of terrorizing a region, for drawing children into crime? The debate is open. Some will say it was too little, that people like this should receive life sentences or the most extreme punishment available. Some will say it was too much, that the system itself is responsible for driving people into crime, and that the root causes need to be addressed, not just the symptoms. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the middle. The fact is that Takhi received what the law judged he deserved. The court examined all the evidence, heard all the witnesses, and gave the defense full opportunity to be heard. The verdict was handed down in accordance with the Criminal Code of Russia. The appeal and cassation review confirmed its legality. This was not a lynching or a vendetta. It was the result of a legal system doing its work. You may disagree with the severity of the punishment, but you cannot say it was unjust. A man committed crimes for more than 10 years, and now he answers for them. What comes next? If he survives to 2032 and is released, he will be 71 years old. It is unlikely he will return to criminal activity. The age is against him, his health is worn down, and the criminal world will have changed in the interim. More likely, he will live out his remaining days quietly, somewhere in the provinces, on a state pension from the government he spent his life treating as an enemy. The irony of fate. Or perhaps he won't live that long. Prison is merciless to the elderly. Illnesses go untreated as they would be outside, and the conditions are grueling. Many do not survive sentences of this length at his age. Either way, his era ended in February 2015, when the door of a Moscow apartment was smashed in by special forces. And the Trans-Baikal region lives its own life. A new generation grows up beyond the reach of AUE, though echoes of that ideology still surface from time to time. Business operates more calmly, free from constant extortion. The police are more wary of corruption schemes. Life moves forward. The story of Takhi has become a legend, spoken of in smoking rooms and around kitchen tables, the subject of crime reports and documentary films. But for most people, it is already the past, a page of history that has been turned. Georgy Uglava, known as Takhi, born May 4, 1961 in Kutaisi, crowned a thief-in-law in 1987 at the age of 25, built a criminal empire in Trans-Baikal that controlled the region for more than 10 years, founded the AUE movement that spread across all of Russia, arrested in February 2015, convicted in 2023 to 17 years and 6 months in prison, scheduled for release in 2032, if he lives to see it. Such is his biography, written in blood, betrayal, millions of stolen rubles, and shattered lives. The story of the rise and fall of a man who wanted to be king of the criminal world, but ended his days in a prison cell, remembering former glory and counting the days until the end of his sentence.